there's some, I think, validity to what used to be mostly a left-wing criticism, but is now increasingly shared by the populist right, that America's been hollowed out, that American elites are just sort of parasitical people who are living off the bounty of the U.S., but they don't really have any allegiance to it. They just live here and make money here. But at the end of the day, they're not patriotic or future-minded with respect to the country itself. I think there's actually some validity to that.
Yeah, I 100% think that that's true. I mean, it does seem like you just, even if like I would argue they were always somewhat parasitic in nature, at least those connected to the political apparatus. And I'm sure you'd agree with me on that. But even like perhaps more intelligent parasites with like a lower time preference who didn't want to blow the whole thing up. There seemed to at least be some sense of like, okay, we can dip into the trough a little bit and a little bit here, but let's like kind of keep this thing going. Whereas today it really does seem like it's like just let's hollow out as much of this as we can and try to hope that the music doesn't stop on our watch and kick it to the next guy or whatever. That seems to be what we're living through. And it's interesting the effect it's had on every different level of society. When you talk about having like a picture of JFK on the wall, it would have been a normal thing. And if you think about today, like if you came into someone's house and saw either a picture of Biden or a picture of Donald Trump, it would almost be viewed as like a declaration of war on half of America. That would almost be a signal that you hate the other half of this country if you had that level of like support for your president. And this is somewhat, for me, I mean, I'm 40. I'm not like a kid, but I'm not old. And I know I hear the young people listening to my show. Okay, to you, I'm old, but to adults, I'm not. But I remember, so I was talking about this one with Joe Rogan when I was on his show a couple weeks ago, and I closed on this with him that I thought it was, to me, the funniest professional wrestling angle that I've ever seen in my entire life. Was in 1991, Sergeant Slaughter, who was the American hero, military guy, wrestler, he defected to Iraq because we lost a lot of good men. We sided with Saddam Hussein in that first Desert Storm war there. And so he defected and he joined up with Saddam Hussein. And like in 1991, it was so easy to just get a crowd full of people just boo, like, boo, you're not. And all you had to do was like hold up an American flag and the entire arena would go nuts for that guy. This was me when I was a little kid. This is what America was like. That there was still kind of this leftover thing from previous generations. Yeah, there he is. Joined the Iraqis. So ridiculous. But that thing is gone. That kind of sense of like patriotism or support for one's country. And I know libertarians could very easily have critiques of patriotism and nationalism and things like that, and some of them very justified. But there's also what it's been replaced with seems to be worse. It seems to be worse than the problems associated with that stuff. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, we certainly have transnational elites. Someone like a George Soros, now he chooses to be involved politically in countries around the world, including the United States. So that makes him a higher profile transnational person. But you could even look at someone like a Warren Buffett, who's quite elderly now and will never expatriate or leave. He'll never go live in Singapore like Jimmy Rogers did. But nonetheless, if you look at the way he invests, he's currently investing in Japan, and I think in part because he likes the spread between interest rates between Japan and the U.S. And so he's not focusing his investments, and he has a responsibility to Berkshire Hathaway investors. I get that. But nonetheless, a guy as old and as rich as he is not focused on the U.S. I mean, he's not focused on shoring up bridge overpasses in the U.S. highway system or something like that. He's not focused on increasing literacy among children in the U.S. He's not focused on obesity or criminality or any of the huge dysfunction we have in this country. The fact that so many people are alienated and isolated and fat and sick and the fact that COVID lockdowns accelerated that. I mean, he's looking at all this from a 50,000 foot perspective of geopolitical global markets and saying, hey, where is there an arbitrage opportunity? That's not what perhaps, even though they certainly had their issues, but a Carnegie or a Rockefeller was building museums and parks and other things with philanthropic dollars. And I don't know offhand, but I'm sure Buffett does lots of good things with his money too. I'm sure he's a charitable guy. But nonetheless, it just seems like his perspective is not that of an American per se. He's sort of transcended that. And that strikes me as, again, late stage for America.
Yeah, it does. Right. It seems that way. And it seems to me that there was, like if you look at the ratios, and I don't have the numbers offhand, but the ratio of like CEO pay to worker pay. And this is something that progressives at least used to bring up a lot. I remember like around the time of Occupy Wall Street, this would come up a lot, that it used to be that the CEO's pay to the average worker's pay was something. It was maybe like 7-1 or something. And it rose up to be like 60-something to 1. Like it's a crazy growth in the disparity of how much people were paying, the people at the top of these firms were paying themselves versus paying their workers. And one of the things, of course, progressives would have the reaction that, oh, this is, income inequality and this is a terrible thing. But I always thought from the libertarian perspective, there was something kind of interesting to that too, because it's not as if there was a regulation in the past that said you can only pay yourself so much more than your average worker. It's not like they were bound by law to do that and then were allowed to get away with not doing it. Yet at some point there was a decision to be made, or even if not a conscious decision, at some point this trend started. And it does kind of make you wonder, like, oh, okay, so what force was it that kept that more in check in the past? And in the same sense of what force was it that, made Henry Ford want to pay his workers a high enough wage so they could get the cars? And this is kind of what I was getting at. We're saying just maybe they were wiser parasites, at least. I'm not accusing Henry Ford of being a parasite, by the way, but I'm just making the point that it does seem like there was at least some type of cultural force that convinced some of these elites that, like, yeah, that might be a problem for you if you did that. That might be seen poorly, and you're doing pretty good, so maybe don't break this game by trying to get away with too much. But that seems to be gone now. There's no more forces like that you would say to someone like George Soros, like, maybe it won't be viewed positively if you're fomenting revolutions around the world. Like, maybe you shouldn't do this because this could end up being bad for you. There doesn't seem to be any restraints in that area.
Well, I think this issue of CEO pay has a lot to do with the Fed.
Yeah.
CEOs respond to incentives. I think by diluting money's value rapidly, you create high time preference. In other words, you create a society where corporate America cares about the next quarter or the next year, as opposed to the next 5 years or 10 years. You skew capital investment away from what we call CapEx, capital expenditures, towards things that sort of juice the income statement or juice the balance sheet under accounting rules to make things look better for the next quarter for the CEO. So it's not this kind of long time horizon. The Sony Corporation in Japan, which has really fallen, but back in the 1990s, they were very dominant in electronics. Sony used to have these 100-year plans, famously. Like, Sony was almost not something beyond a corporation. It was like a way of life or a cult or something. And that's, we don't really have that in America. So what we'd like our economists to do is help us understand the unseen. How do you prove or trace that the Fed has created a bunch of financial engineering? In other words, financialize the economy in a way that distorts things like corporate activities and CEO pay. It's not so, we can say that, but to prove that requires economists to show us the unseen, all the things that could have happened if we hadn't had the Fed being so aggressive as it has been. And what's interesting, when you bring up the left and populism, I mean, it was really, I guess, starting with Alan Greenspan, we can even go back that far, but certainly under Bernanke, where the left started to love the Fed. All of a sudden, the left thinks the Fed is great. And then Janet Yellen comes along and they're cheering the Fed. The Congressional Black Caucus is saying, oh, the Fed is helping less affluent blacks get mortgages easier. And of course, then a lot of them lost their houses in the '08 crash. But, so it's really interesting how the left came to love the Fed. Now, there are certainly good people on the left who understand its distortive effects. People like Jimmy Dore, Nomi Prinz. There are people writing about this. David Stockman did such a great job of writing about how the financialization of Paulson and others coming out of that '08 crisis really just benefited Wall Street, under the guise of this contagion would have spread to Main Street. And David Stockman says, no, it would not have. So it's all really fascinating to me, how the Fed is viewed by people. And it's I'm convinced it's one of the biggest untold stories of our lifetimes, is how the Fed distorts not only the U.S. economy, but U.S. culture, U.S. society, even down to individual actions. When borrowing is easier than it otherwise would have been, how does that spread out through society like throwing a pebble in a pond? I would argue it's enormous.